Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Institute of International Affairs, I would like to welcome you to this seminar here today. This is the last of 3 seminars which the Institute is hosting in collaboration with the European Union Info Center in Iceland. Today we will discuss the fundamental question on the future of the EEA Agreement. The focus is set on the prospects of the agreement and whether its importance for the European Union is diminishing. Moreover, does the agreement fully serve the interest of the people in the EEA countries? From the Icelandic perspective, it is clear that the EEA Agreement is the most extensive international treaty which Iceland has acceded to, and its effects on the Icelandic society and legal system are wide and far-reaching. The EU has been developing at high speed in the recent years, and this has put increased pressure on the EEA Agreement. Among other issues, it has raised some crucial constitutional questions in Iceland, as the implementations of obligations under the EEA Agreement requires increased transfer of state power to European institutions. In addition, it may become difficult to adjust the two-pillar system, the cornerstone of the EEA Agreement, to the institutional development which now takes place within the European Union. Does this call for a fundamental revision and adjustment of the EEA Agreement, and is there a political willingness to take that path? Today we will cast a light on some of these practical and highly important aspects, such as the current status of the EEA Agreement, potential problems, and hopefully some potential solutions and suggestions on how to proceed. It is a great pleasure to welcome our main speakers, Mr. Stefán Haukur Jóhannesson, Ms. Ingvild Nes Stubb, and Gianluca Grippa, as well as the participants who will join the panel discussion afterwards. The seminar is organized in the way that each main speaker will give their presentation. It will be 20 minutes long at the most, even shorter. So thereafter we will invite the panel participants up here, and each of them will have around 5 minutes to comment briefly on the presentations, and then we will take questions from the audience. Hopefully we will be able to create a good discussion on the topic. But I would like to say that as a moderator, I will try to stick to our time schedule, and we aim at concluding the seminar at 3:30 at the latest. But we will now start with our first main speaker, Mr. Stefán Haukur Jóhannesson. Mr. Jóhannesson is a permanent secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iceland and an experienced diplomat and negotiator. He was chief negotiator in Iceland's accession talks with the European Union in 2009 to 2013. He served as a permanent representative to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva, was ambassador to the EU, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Liechtenstein, and was chairman of the working group on Russia's accession to the WTO. And in 2014, he has been a team leader with the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. So, Mr. Jóhannesson, please take the floor.
Thank you, Björn. Is it on? Yes. Very good. So, dear guests and fellow speakers, let me begin by welcoming you all to this discussion today on the EEA Agreement. And let me in particular welcome our 2 guests from Brussels and Oslo. And it is indeed an honor for me to open a seminar on such an important topic. The EEA Agreement has now been in force for 20 years and has fulfilled its very purpose of being a deep and comprehensive agreement. And as you indicated in your introductory remarks, probably the most comprehensive or extensive international treaty that we have acceded to. And not only that, it's extremely dynamic agreement because we are constantly adopting legislation from the EU and through the EEA and integrating that into our domestic legislation, and that's exactly what we are discussing here today, inter alia. So, as I said, I think it's indeed has fulfilled its promise and purpose of being a deep and comprehensive agreement on trade within an extended European single market. Now, at the same time, the agreement has been the main pillar of our relations between us, the United States, and the European Union, which is for all the three EEA countries the most important trading partner. I should add that, for example, Iceland exports to the EU countries more than, for example, France does, although we are not a member state of the EU, obviously, but France is, just to indicate the importance for the internal market for us. And I'm indeed particularly pleased to have with us here today State Secretary Stubb, and in this context, and I want to underline that the three EEA states enjoy rich cooperation, and the longevity and the robustness of the EEA agreement, which I will turn to in a moment, would never be sustained without this excellent cooperation we enjoy. We value greatly what our Norwegian friends have done in the context of the EEA and draw heavily on their experience. We have been looking into the way in which they are dealing with the EEA cooperation domestically. And we are indeed in this together, and I would like to use the opportunity to thank our Norwegian friends for this meaningful cooperation. There is probably no need to lecture you on what the in this audience on the ins and outs of the EEA agreement, what it is all about. But let us keep in mind that the main purpose of the agreement, in a nutshell, revolves around the so-called four freedoms, namely free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And it is essential to make sure that all obstacles are removed in order for these freedoms, these four freedoms, to function well, and if we are to enjoy the full potential of the agreement. That is why the single market and EEA is all about extensive harmonization of rules and standards and homogeneity. It's a common platform and a common denominator. Just to illustrate the point, it is indeed much more simple, and this is what it is all about. For example, an exporter of fish fillets you only have to fulfill one set of rules on sanitary and phytosanitary issues, rather than a set of, let's say, 27 or 8 rules. So it's about harmonization and free flow of products in the market. So it is, this is all about that, to make sure that each country does not put technical obstacles in place in order to prevent trade and the free movement of these four freedoms. Now, in practice, for businesses and individuals, this means that they have the same rights and obligations as EU businesses and citizens in 31 member states of the EEA, namely the 28 EU and the 3 EFTA EEA countries. Under normal circumstances, no questions are asked and no further special requirements need to be fulfilled. This obviously facilitates the lives of exporters and importers, new businesses, individuals, pensioners, students, etc., to enjoy the freedoms that are provided to them by the EEA agreement. This short and concise depiction of the overall goals of the EEA illustrates the importance of making sure that rules and regulations in the EFTA states are in line with the EEA agreement, and that this is done in a timely manner. To paraphrase this, if we do not implement EEA rules in a timely fashion, it only means that our businesses and people are not on equal footing, and then there is a level playing field. So for Iceland, the effective running of the agreement is in the interest of our export industries and our citizens. This is the background to the government's decision last year to adopt a specific policy priorities on Europe. It is because good functioning of the EEA agreement is a key element for our economy and one important pillar of our cooperation with the European Union. The government's policy priorities were presented in March of last year, and amongst other things, the priorities aim to raise the profile of EEA issues on the political arena and with the administration, within the administration. EEA issues are now regularly on the agenda of the government and the state secretaries. We have intensified the work on all levels, for example, awareness raising with the aim of lubricating our machinery to reduce the backlog, and the implementation deficit. A steering group on EEA affairs under the Prime Minister's office was also set up, and it is expected to identify bottlenecks and soon proposals for further improvements. We are also in the process of identifying priority areas in the EEA and issues that will become subject to specific analysis on our part. In this, we hope to be able to better use our resources when it comes to early involvement in the decision shaping on the EU side. We have also established a consultation group with representatives from the economic operators, which will have a role regarding the priority issues we intend to identify for early involvement. This is a very important element that further underscores the importance we place on it. The main objective of the government's policy on Europe is to push harder and do better in the running of the agreement. It means that we need to be more effective in incorporating the new rules into the agreement and to implement them in a more efficient manner. It is not acceptable for Iceland to be time and again one of the worst in the class, sitting close to the bottom of the single market's implementation scoreboard. It is not acceptable for stakeholders in the EEA that it takes Iceland on average 17 months to incorporate new acts into the EEA agreement. The policy foresees that we take a hard look at how we work internally in order to see how we can become more efficient. The good news is that we are making good progress in different areas of the new policy. Unfortunately, good news are not always headline material. We have clearly increased the focus on the EEA, and good and meaningful work is being carried out in assessing how we are operating in this field, and we expect proposals on that front soon. And we also see progress in the numbers. We incorporate acts at more speed than ever before. In this context, it's worth mentioning, I should add, that in 2014, it was actually a record year in the number of acts that we have taken up in the EEA, or the second biggest in the history of the EEA in terms of the number of acts incorporated. So that may partly explain the increased backlog, because there is indeed, which means indeed increased acts that we need to incorporate and take through the domestic process. So we have been moving in the right direction over the past year, and I can assure you that we will demonstrate improvements in the scoreboard to be published this summer. Iceland is slowly but surely cutting its implementation deficit from over 3% to 2.8% and close to 2% in the scoreboard that will be published later in the summer. But let me underline that 1% is and still and remains our target. Dear guests, the EEA Agreement has, as I mentioned, been the pillar of the three EEA states' economic relations with Europe for 20 years now. And I can state unreservedly that from whatever angle we look at the EEA, it has been a success story. Much has happened in the intervening 2 decades since the agreement entered into force. Europe has gone through fundamental changes, and lately deep-rooted economic crises that have been so very challenging both for the EU and its individual member states. For its part, Iceland has also gone through tremendous change during the EEA era. We have seen large-scale economic growth, and we have seen an unprecedented economic collapse a few years back. The EEA was an agreement that was a result of long and hard negotiations that were conducted in a totally different political, economic, and social landscape than that what we have today. Even the wise mothers and fathers of the EEA could not have envisaged the changes we have seen in the past years, with fundamental institutional changes within the EU, the sheer number of EFTA countries that became EU members, and the enlargements to the east and south of the EU. However, let me stress this important point that the EEA Agreement, its flexibility, adaptability, and its robustness bears witness to that as long as there is a political will, there is a way. We have managed to overcome these challenges we have faced in these 20 years, and we've always found our way. So for all the reasons I mentioned, there is a constant need for debate on the EEA Agreement. We need to keep the necessary focus and watchful eye on the agreement. And we needed to discuss its pros and cons, its constitutional challenges, and its importance in our solid relations with the EU. We remain committed to the EEA Agreement and its good functioning. Let me conclude by saying that we can never afford to take the EEA Agreement for granted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Next speaker is Ms. Ingvild Nes Stubb, State Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway. She was head of information for the European Movement of Norway from 2003 to 2005, and a political advisor for the Conservative Party parliamentary group in Norway from 2008 and 2013. So please, Ingvild, take the floor.
Thank you so much, Björn. It's great, as always, to be back here in Iceland. In fact, Iceland is fast becoming my second home, and that is a testament to the centrality of the Norwegian-Icelandic relationship to the EEA Agreement. While talking here, of course, today, the context is one in which Europe is faced with its most serious challenges in the post-war era. We have Russia challenging the very foundation of cooperation in Europe through its illegal actions in Ukraine, and we have migration from the south and southeast putting European cooperation to an immense test in addressing this problem in a comprehensive way, based on the idea of solidarity and burden sharing. And in this last context, we know Iceland is contributing very significantly already Norway is on its way to. For Norway, this highlights the ever-increasing importance of working closely with our European partners. For Europe's borders are our borders, and Europe's values are our values. And solidarity with our partners and the challenges of our continent remains a core Norwegian principle. The EEA Agreement, of course, is at the very center of this cooperation. It underlines our very strong interest in a strong, free, fair and open market in Europe to the benefit of our peoples. Norway, in fact, benefits from this every day. 80% of our exports go to the EU and 65% of our imports come from the EU. They are by far our biggest trading partner, and we rate fifth on the EU's list, even considering our limited size. In 2013, we received 192,000 labour migrants from the EEA countries. That is 7% of our labour force. Many of these end up in rural areas where local industry is totally dependent on them for their survival and for the survival of the surrounding municipalities. It is in fact difficult to overstate their importance to the Norwegian economy and, by extension, to Norwegian welfare. In this context, we must also mention Erasmus+, which allows the youth of our countries to seek educational experiences across Europe, binding our continent together, creating Europeans. Over 2 million youth benefit from this annually, and 22,500 Norwegians have been abroad under this program and its predecessors since 1995. Thousands have also come our way. When discussing the future of the EEA Agreement, we must also recognize what it has delivered so far. It's existed for more than 20 years, and it is no secret that this coincides with a period of significant growth for the continent as a whole. For Norway, these years have been marked by a highly favourable economic development after a slump in the early 90s, with all indicators pointing in the right direction. An increase in GDP of around 50%. An increase in employment of around 500,000 people, 25%, and a reduction in unemployment from around 6% in 1993 to 3.7% at the end of 2014. While we may of course attribute this to many factors also beyond the EEA, it seems an undisputed fact that the barriers brought down in this process, both to trade, research, labour and other mobility, have all contributed significantly to the growth of our economies ever since. All graphs have pointed upwards for more than 2 decades. And this is a backdrop that must be remembered when starting to look into the crystal ball of the future. Our economic integration through the EEA. In many circles in Norway, it's been a favourite pastime to badmouth the EEA Agreement for various reasons. The opponents of closer integration with the rest of Europe may have felt that this was one step towards what was most dreaded by them, membership. On the other side of the spectrum, the people arguing in favour of membership felt that the EEA Agreement was more an obstacle to achieving their objective, a case of glass half empty rather than half full. As a result, very few have spoken out actively and enthusiastically in its defence. An explanation for this may be that in Norway the EEA Agreement has represented the lowest common denominator, what all sides could live with, a national compromise safeguarding our economic interests. But few saw it as the optimal solution they may have wanted. This situation is now coming back to haunt us a little bit, and it's crucial, I think, that we remind ourselves of what we have. When coming to power in October 2013, this government set out to make Europe a priority after an 8-year period where our predecessors in office, to a great extent, had neglected our own continent, neighbours, friends, allies, and main trading partners. As a consequence, the EEA Agreement also has suffered with a growing backlog of legal acts and a culture of relative indifference seeping into parts of our bureaucracy. We appointed Norway's first ever Minister for Europe, or more correctly referred to as the Minister for EEA and EU Affairs, Mr. Vidar Helgesen, my boss. We have a clearly defined European strategy. We have a rather detailed accompanying work program spelling out how the strategy should be put into practice, where to focus our efforts, and which benchmarks for progress going forward. A key new development is the establishment of a Government Council on European Affairs, convening monthly at ministerial level in differing configurations depending on the topics at hand. The main ambition herein is defining more clearly and more quickly Norwegian positions on the key policy issues facing Europe and being discussed in Brussels at any given time. This is based on the realization that there is scope for working more closely with the Commission and Member States on policy formulation in the pre-acquis stage. Proactive rather than just reactive. In addition, this is a key instrument to address the backlog, as the ministers provide a status update on their pending legal acts. Still, we politicians also need to realize that beyond policies, strategies, programs, and procedures, what it ultimately comes down to is our commitment to making this European policy work. Our predecessors in office frequently talked about their active European policy. But when ministers neither take part in informal ministerials in the EU nor actively seek to engage with Europe on our many issues of common concerns, those words ring hollow. Also in this respect, we aim to be different. While underlining the centrality of the EEA Agreement to our European policy and how it has served us well, one must keep in mind that this is an agreement in need of constant care. Since its creation, the ratio of EU members to non-members has changed dramatically in the EU's favour. That, coupled with the inherent structural fact that amending legal acts after they've been sanctioned by the EU 28 is, to put it mildly, an uphill struggle, that puts us at a disadvantage. The EEA Agreement requires that Norway and our partners, Liechtenstein and Iceland, should be consulted in the early stages of EU decision-making. But we are, of course, merely consulted. The EU is under no obligation to listen. We have to work hard to make our voice heard. A parallel challenge is the fact that the extent of knowledge and understanding of the EEA Agreement is waning, while the responsibility of emphasizing its importance to all its 31 members rests increasingly on the EFTA3. One thing is us knowing the value of our participation in the internal market. It is another to convey this to an, at times, increasingly introverted EU. And this needs to be addressed too. Accepting this fact for mutual benefits stemming from our participation, it follows logically that its future existence requires a common effort. But what must not be lost upon us in doing this is the equally heavy burden hanging over us three on the outside to make this work. Article 1 of the EEA Agreement spells out clearly the ambition of creating a homogeneous European economic area with equal conditions of competition. We are constantly reminded by our private sector, our businesses, the foundation of our welfare, how crucial this is to their work and how some of them have suffered as a result of the backlog. In this picture, we need to remind ourselves of the obvious fact that our companies depend relatively more on a market of 28 than companies of the 28 depend on the three of us. We cannot allow the agreement to be undermined by our failure to adhere to Article 1. A key element in the EEA Agreement is also the principle of unanimity. No legal act is taken into the agreement in the absence of consent from all three of us, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway alike. In reality, it gives each of us a veto which not only affects ourselves, but also our EEA partners. Legal acts held up by one of us today may harm the economies of all three as we speak. This is a reality that I believe we all need to reflect on more carefully than we do when we tend to get bogged down in our own domestic concerns. Our responsibility rests on all of us that reach beyond our own borders. We need to have our common interest in mind. Are we doing enough? Well, it's always difficult to justify using the word enough, and this case is no exception. As long as the various backlogs exist, we cannot say that the market is entirely homogeneous, which means we can and must do more. But let me here as well pay tribute to the efforts of Stefan and his colleagues in the Icelandic government, who have undertaken a series of initiatives to further improve their EEA administration and reduce the backlog, as have we. And I think we are beginning to see the effects, and I hope that they will be even more visible in the future. Looking into the future, I repeat what I said initially. This agreement has proven its worth over a long time. No matter what critics say, it has delivered prosperity and stability. Any talk of its demise, therefore, will need to address the question of what are the better alternatives. Well, from a Norwegian perspective, I see none. The domestic debate sometimes likes to throw out the Swiss model as one alternative. Well, does the Swiss model even exist, or is it about to expire? Looking at the negotiations that have barely started between Bern and Brussels, I believe this model is fast fading. Others point to the EFTA Free Trade Agreement of 1973 still in place. But does this really serve the interests of our ever more sophisticated private sectors, let alone the wishes of a very mobile population and workforce? And I believe the answer to that is a resounding no. But then there are those recently in the Norwegian debate who look even further afield, for example, to South Korea. Again, we are talking about agreements that leave out key elements while including others like agriculture. It is hard to imagine that model finding any real traction in my country, and I think I may assume the same thing here in Iceland. Well, as for membership, which is my own party's preferred option, is off the table while public opinion stands firm at 70% opposing EU membership. We come back to the start, whether we like it or not. As my minister put it during a speech last week, if you can't have the one you love, you've got to love the one you have. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have given you the conclusion. The EEA agreement must be deemed fit for the future, and we will have to do all that is in our power to preserve it. It is not an a la carte agreement where we can allow ourselves to pick and choose. The primary question will revolve around EEA relevance. Once that box is ticked off, we must seek a speedy incorporation of the legal act in question, and it obliges all three of us alike. Any hesitance along this route will primarily hurt ourselves, our own companies and citizens, rather than anyone else. As long as the agreement is in effect, we owe it to them and to our EEA partners to observe it diligently. Thank you so much for discussing this matter, for putting it on the agenda. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Yes, then we'll have Mr. Gianluca Grippa as the next speaker. Gianluca has since 2010 been the head of division for the European External Action Service in the EU, responsible for relations with the countries of Western Europe such as Switzerland, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. He started his work with the European Commission in 1993. In 2001 he joined the Directorate General for External Relations in Brussels, and from 2006 he has been a deputy head of unit dealing with the Middle East. And from present, he is one of the EU's main representatives towards the EEA Agreement and was a chair of the EEA Joint Committee for years. Please.
Thank you very much for the floor. The advantages of age that the USCB becomes longer, not necessarily more important, but it is longer. Permanent Secretary Mr. Johannesson, State Secretary too, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to join today's meeting and debate and share with you on behalf of the European External Action Service and the European Commission our view on the key aspects in the functioning of the EEA Agreement, while highlighting some relevant elements of direct interest for Iceland. We have noted that the EEA Agreement has lately become the focus of much more public and political debate in Iceland. We are also looking forward to the planned review Iceland is about to undertake on the extent to which the agreement continues to serve Iceland's interests, on the problem Iceland is currently facing in the implementation of the agreement, as well as on the country's priorities in the coming years, in order to boost its benefits out of the membership in this very select European Economic Area. As we have been preparing to celebrate 20 years, some years ago, since the entry into force of the agreement, important EEA reviews have been conducted by us as well as by Norway back in 2012, and another one by Liechtenstein in 2013. Responding to the invitation by the European Council in December 2010, we, as the overall manager of the EEA Agreement, in very close coordination with the Commission services, had conducted for the first time such an internal exercise to review the functioning of the agreement. The scope of the exercise was not to review the overall relations with Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, and not even to look for options for the future. Sorry for the title of your... It was rather more limited and focused on the functioning of the agreement and on possible options to increase its efficiency within the existing framework. The key messages out of the review have been that the EEA has proven an efficient and broadly well-functioning means to extend the benefits of almost fully participating in the EU internal market, a certain policy, to the 3 EEA EFTA states. At the same time, the review highlighted the fact that the EEA participation incurs clear obligation as it requires a legal, institutional, and economic capacity to incorporate and implement correctly, regularly, and almost simultaneously a substantial volume of EEA-relevant legal acts. It is beyond any doubt that the EU legislative, institutional, and market conditions under which the agreement has been negotiated 20 years ago are very different from the ones of today. The level of market integration in the EU has been continuously deepening, and application of the same rules in both the EU and the EEA EFTA states has become even more paramount. However, in the absence of modification to the text of the EEA agreement, the EEA EFTA states have to accommodate to the new reality of this advanced level of EU market integration. Any prolonged delays in both incorporating and applying the EEA relevant legislation risk triggering serious distortions of competition to the detriment of EU companies in the same market. For illustration, in April this year, we have registered 461 EU legal acts still pending incorporation into the agreement. This backlog is a source of serious concern to us and which strengthen our efforts to remedy the situation. The situation is not much better once the legal acts are actually incorporated into the agreement. In accordance to the Internal Market Scoreboard published by the EFTA Surveillance Authority in April 2015, Iceland has the highest transposition deficit of 2.8 of all the 28 EU member states and the 3 EFTA states. Such delays in the incorporation undermine the legal homogeneity and supervisory regime of the entire European Economic Area, and hereby risk infringing upon one of the core provisions of the agreement, which, in its Article 1, sets as key objective the need to achieve equal conditions for competition and respect of the same rules. I understand this might sound quite abstract, but just to illustrate what delays might mean in financial terms, let me mention to you there have been studies according to which, the full implementation of the single market rules, and I'm talking now about the EU member states, would mean an additional economic growth of about 6%. So if you transpose this for the EEA states, you see that there is an interest also for the EEA states to fully implement the rules of the internal market. The advanced level of market integration should not prevent us from reaching agreements on the EEA relevance on some new EU legislation, such as the Offshore Directive or the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. And it should not stop either reaching agreements on the new generation of EU agencies with decision-making powers, which are given the same powers vis-à-vis the EEA EFTA national authorities. This is the case for the European supervisory agencies in the area of financial services, the body of European regulators of electronic communication, or the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators. We should by any means avoid the duplication of such agencies through the establishment of new bodies within the EFTA pillar that would only increase the risk of having divergent decisions taken in the EU EFTA sites and hereby threatening the requirement of homogeneity in internal market. We have to be clear, the benefits of the EEA agreements are relatively more measurable for the EEA EFTA states, which are able to access a market of more than 500 million people, than for the EU member states. As already acknowledged by the EEA reviews conducted by Norway and Liechtenstein, access to the EU single market for goods, services, workers and capital has had a quantifiable positive impact year by year on the EFTA countries' growth, trade, job creation direct investment and competitiveness. Just for an example that has already been mentioned, EU represent 73% of Icelandic export and 43% of imports. In the case of Norway, it is 80% of Norway export and 60% of imports. I think that we have to confront the figures there. And the trade surpluses with the EU are constantly increasing. The unique legislative fabric of the EU is producing one of the most modern legislation in the world that is able to efficiently regulate the intertwined public policies of the 28 member states. This legislation is the result of an inclusive, transparent, and democratic decision-making process. By incorporating this ready-made EEA relevant legislation, the EFTA states are not only constantly modernizing the legislative backbone of their economies. The EFTA states' regulatory convergence with the single markets for freedom substantively strengthen the competitive standing and attractiveness of their products and services worldwide, while their citizens and companies enjoy the same consumer protection or competition rules as the ones enforced in the EU. There are voices here in Iceland and all the EFTA states deploring the democratic deficit of the EEA Agreement, given the fact that your countries do not have the rights to vote. This is formally true. However, let's not forget that both the EEA Agreement and the EU decision-making process provide for multiple key upstream channels to the EFTA states to voice and encode their interest in the final form of the EEA relevant legislation as adopted at EU level. And just as an example, I got a colleague of mine that told me that due to Norwegian outspoken representative, they decided to modify a legislation, and now Norway doesn't want to incorporate it. So as you see, I mean, we listen a lot to what our EEA partners tell us. The absence of the right to vote cannot be an excuse for delays in both incorporation and implementation of the EEA relevant legislation. We welcome back in March 2014 the Icelandic government's announcement of a new political focus on the agreement in the form of a policy on Europe dedicated to strengthening the efficient implementation of the agreement and the representation of Iceland's interests in this framework. We have been made aware of many intentions in this regard, including on ways to increase Alþingi's capacities administration and monitoring of the implementation of the agreement. We have always expressed our appreciation for the closer scrutiny of EEA's legislation by the EEA EFTA parliaments. However, there should be ways to address the overall emerging delays and setbacks deriving from the parliamentary procedures. And even if individual countries are more advanced in clearing the procedure checks, as was already mentioned by Ms. Tube, the EFTA principle of speaking with one voice obliges them to wait until everyone has finalized the procedure. Before I conclude, I would like to say a few words about another subject that is linked to the EEA, but it's very important to us, and this is the state of play in the ongoing negotiation on renewing the European Economic Area Financial Mechanism and the additional fish protocols of the free trade agreements with Iceland. As you are probably aware, the 2009-2014 EEA financial mechanism that the EU highly appreciates expired roughly a year ago. So did the fish trade concession Iceland enjoys. Negotiations for the renewal of this mechanism are ongoing for 15 months. I believe that we were close to the finishing line, but a final effort is needed to cross that line, possibly before the summer break. Let me explain to you the EU main objectives. Firstly, the EU would like to get an increase of the financial contribution to reflect the increased economic and social disparities within the EEA due to the economic crisis. This, of course, is not for all the EEA EU member states, it's for a certain part of the EU member states, the ones that we used to call the new EU members, meaning the countries of Eastern Europe, joined since 2004. I believe our request is fair and reasonable. We have also shown some flexibility and lowered our original request, a flexibility we hope to get reciprocated by an increase or counter-offer from the EFTA side. Secondly, one of the main subjects of the negotiation was the importance of addressing the negative consequences of youth unemployment. The idea and the discussion, namely Global Fund for Regional Cooperation, could possibly provide a solution for this issue. Thirdly, after 11 years post-enlargement, the EU cannot accept to apply distribution keys that discriminate between EU member states. This problem is linked to the Norway grant. Nevertheless, I believe it is to be mentioned also here so that you are provided with the full picture. Fourthly, it's a good time to move to a 7-year programming period. The problem with the current 5 years approach is that it will create a policy cycle asymmetry with EU cohesion policy. In 2018, when we should start thinking whether or not to continue the EEA financial mechanism, the EU won't yet have any clear views on its 2020-2027 cohesion policy and budget. Finally, we believe that setting priorities that complement that of the EU's 2020 would benefit both the beneficiary and donors through increased synergies and a higher concentration of the support provided. Progress in this negotiation will positively affect the outcome of parallel discussion on special tariff quotas for Iceland access to the EU market for fish and fish products. Let me finally say that the European Economic Area Agreement served us well for more than 20 years. You already heard it several times. Its success and the benefits the EEA EFTA countries are deriving from it are, however, not self-understood. They depend heavily on a continuous political commitment and institutional work to fully respect all its implementation provisions. The agreement is deriving its strength also from an outstanding level of trust. We should capitalize on this trust in order to overcome all the pending challenges in the function of the agreement and make sure that it provides us with a sustainable source of inspiration, competitiveness, and prosperity for the decades to come. Thank you very much for your attention.